This is Lindsay Russell Dexter. I'm Director of the Task Force on Education at the American Legislative Exchange Council. I would like to take just a few minutes to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Michael Brickman is the National Policy Director at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, where he serves as a commentator on education reform and other related topics. He's a frequent contributor to Fordham's various publications, as well as prominent radio, television, and print outlets. Michael served in communication roles on state and national political campaigns before being tapped by Governor Scott Walker to lead his education policy efforts in Wisconsin. While the governor's office, he worked to support collective bargaining reforms, increase standards and accountability, expand school choice, and keep college affordable through innovative new initiatives. Thank you, Michael, for moderating the Common Core webinar representing the future, or excuse me, the present, or yes, excuse me, the future. With that, I will turn the time over to you.
Thanks, Lizzie. Really appreciate it. And really, for those of you who are joining today but haven't had a chance to join some of the other webinars hosted by Alec so far, I just wanted to give kind of a quick recap of where we've been. So where has the Common Core been? Where do we stand right now? And then I'm going to kick it over in just a couple of minutes to Rick Hess on where we're going in the future on the Common Core. So first, just to get the disclaimer out of the way, Alec, when it comes to Common Core, has a neutral position. So these webinars are really just about providing a brief overview of the issue, and so the decision makers at the state level can make some of those decisions for themselves. So with that, where have we been when it comes to the Common Core? So this really goes back to the early Clinton administration, some would say even before, but really it was then that states started talking seriously about developing concrete expectations, concrete goals, otherwise known as standards, for what we expect students to know in K through 12 education. And it really came to fruition through the No Child Left Behind law that was, of course, passed in the Bush administration, that said that every state had to have basic standards, basic expectations at the end of each grade level for what students were expected to know in English and in mathematics. And states did just that, and they also, on top of it, developed a set of assessments to measure whether students were actually meeting those goals. And so that was kind of put in place, the problem being that the No Child Left Behind law, which is being, the reauthorization is being debated in Congress right now, said that all students had to be proficient, 100% had to be proficient in English and math by 2014. Well, if you've checked your calendars, we didn't exactly meet that, and so now we're trying to figure out why students weren't able to meet 100% proficiency on these expectations set by states. And oh, by the way, when the states set these standards, they were not very rigorous. They didn't expect a whole lot of students to, by the time they graduated from high school, compared with what students were expected to do in college or in the workforce once they actually got that high school diploma. And so you saw states get together and really through the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, they got together to set higher standards, to set a higher bar for students so that the expectations at the end of 12th grade would align with the expectations at the end, at the beginning of college or one's career. And it's worth pointing out that there were some states that did have good standards. Some, like California, had good standards on paper but didn't do a very good job of implementing them. Some, like Massachusetts, had both good standards and good implementation. But the vast majority of states had some combination of fairly poor standards and fairly poor implementation. And so ultimately, this effort, through a collaboration of the various states, was developed. It ended up being called the Common Core State Standards Initiative, and it was adopted by 45 states, really 45 and a half if you include Minnesota just taking half of the standards. But a lot of that, and I think both Common Core opponents and supporters would agree that a lot of that had to do with the Obama administration not only attempting to take credit for this initiative, but they really tried to push it on states. They offered incentives, they made it part of their other initiatives, and really did everything they could to encourage states to adopt these standards. Now, of course, many states would have adopted them anyway, but it probably would not have been 45.5 states. It would have been a smaller number, maybe as small as somewhere in the teens, maybe as high as in the 30s, but probably would have been a handful of states that would have gone with a different set of standards or would have just kept the ones they had in place before. And so as a result of some of this prodding by the Obama administration, there's been some pushback, and there have been some states that have wanted to go with something else. They fear that this, as George Will has said, could be the leading edge of what ended up becoming a national curriculum, which I think the vast majority of people out there do not want to see, especially on the right. And so you've seen, for example, the state of Oklahoma has repealed these standards. They're going to set up an initiative to develop new ones that may or may not end up looking similar to the Common Core. You've seen other states, Indiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, Missouri, are somewhere along the process of reviewing and revising the Common Core to make changes, which of course is states' right to do. And so I think that what we saw in the last legislative session was really kind of this becoming transitioning from a very wonky issue to one that was really on people's radars. And Rick's going to talk about what that means for the upcoming legislative session, what it might mean in Congress, and what it will mean for you all as people who follow education policy very closely. But first, just a quick word of introduction for Rick. Rick is the resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I can say, knowing him personally, he's a very smart guy, really brings these issues to life. I've been, not to make Rick feel old, but reading some of his books and other works since college, and he's really somebody for, even if you're not a uber policy wonk when it comes to education policy, really makes these issues accessible, and it really gets down to what some of these complex issues are all about. So he's got some insight. I think he's probably maybe not a Common Core denier, but at least a Common Core skeptic. And he's, as he is known to do, has written a lot about this, has written a book on this called Common Core Meets Education Reform, What It All Means for Politics, Policy, and the Future of Schooling. So he's absolutely an expert on where we've been, where we're going when it comes to Common Core. And with that, I'll just leave it to Rick, who's going to give you kind of a sense of where we're going with Common Core, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Appreciate the kind words. Appreciate the chance to be with all of you today. Appreciate you taking the time to visit with me. I'm going to take, I guess, about 15 to 20 minutes. I want to walk you through about six pretty simple ideas. One, just make sure we understand when we look at that Common Core going forward, what are we talking about? A second is why trying to use standards to change what happens in classrooms is pretty challenging. Third, how states might address some of the practical or political challenges posed by the Common Core. Fourth, what's going to happen with the Common Core tests, which are really what matter most. Fifth, how a couple of the external political things, like No Child Left Behind and the presidential primaries, might affect things. And then finally, just a word or two about what I'd anticipate over the next 2-3 years. So like I said, we'll move pretty quickly. First, let's keep in mind that when we talk about the Common Core, there's really two pretty tightly bundled but easily separated theories of how standards are going to help improve schools and help kids. One is the notion that the Common Core standards are higher, better, that they are more college and career ready, more rigorous than other state standards. You heard Mike allude to this. Look, I'm somebody who's been in and around teaching in high school classrooms a quarter century ago, teaching in schools of education, I think the Common Core is fine. I've never been as persuaded that it is clearly a better set of standards as some of my friends. There is a second theory of action under the Common Core, which is that it is common. The idea is that you don't want railroad gauge to be 3 feet wide in South Carolina and 4 feet wide in North Carolina. Because if that happens, you're going to have a whole lot of trains going off the rails between the states. And one of the strong arguments in my mind for the Common Core was that we've always had a lot of trains going off those rails. When you try to write textbooks or develop online materials for students, you're trying to do that not for 1 or 2 kind of markets, but for 50 markets. So you wind up spending a lot more time and energy on your sales force and on tweaks than necessarily on designing the best product. When you are training educators, you're training teachers to teach in different systems which teach different material at different grade levels. It creates challenges. So when we talk about why some people think the Common Core is good for kids in classrooms, some people will argue that it is just clearly a better set of standards. Others will argue that it's beneficial because it's common. This matters a lot for reasons we'll talk about in just one moment. One key thing to keep in mind is that both camps agree that the standards themselves actually matter a lot less than the tests those standards are used to create. Even David Coleman, the guy who head up the Common Core, gave a big speech a couple years ago where he said, look, let's not kid ourselves. Nobody cares what standards say on paper. What matters is what's on the test, because that's what teachers are going to teach to. So he said the Common Core will matter if it creates tests that are good and worth teaching to. So any of these impacts, whether of the commonality or the rigor, only matter if tests actually reflect that. All right, second thing is that when it comes to implementing any of this stuff, as Mike mentioned, dozens of states, north of 40 states, adopted the Common Core standards in a pretty big rush in 2009, 2010. A lot of them because it dramatically increased your chances of getting a chunk of race to the top money. Many of these states actually adopted the Common Core before the final version of the Common Core was ever even released. So there was a little bit of buying a pig in a poke there. But what you wound up with was lots of states said, okay, these are our state standards. Well, for those of you guys who aren't educators, you might ask yourselves, well, what does that mean? You know, you go into McDonald's or Burger King and you see a mission statement on the wall which says, we promise fast, speedy service and delightful food. And you might say, all right, well, how much does that mission statement matter for the experience I'm actually about to purchase? Same question can always be asked of standards, Common Core or any other standard. And the answer is Common Core really matters mostly like any standards based on the tests that emerge from it, but particularly through those tests and through those standards, how are you changing what's taught in curricula? Hello?
If you just joined, please make sure to put your phone or your computer on mute. Thanks.
Okay. How it affects curricula, how it affects texts and instructional materials kids will use in classrooms, how it affects the state's accountability system, how it affects how teachers are trained, and what teachers are taught when they're getting prepared for classrooms. Now, the reality is to do the Common Core the way advocates think it can and should be done, you need to change all of those things. You want to change your curricula. You're going to want to buy new texts that reflect these new curricular approaches. You're going to want to make sure your accountability system reflects the reality of Common Core instruction, and especially the fact that a lot more students may be failing on Common Core tests. And you want to make sure that teachers are being trained and prepared to teach this stuff well. All of those things require that school districts change the books they use, how they train teachers. It requires that dollars be moved. It requires that states typically increase their investment to pay for new materials, to help pay for new assessments. Now, the easiest way for folks who want to stop the Common Core to stop the Common Core is not going to be to de-adopt, as Mike mentioned, in places like Oklahoma and Indiana, where it becomes really controversial and political to dump the Common Core and then have to go out and replace it. The easiest way for folks to not adopt the Common Core is going to be to not use Common Core tests, to not pay for Common Core tests, to not put dollars into these other things that you need to change. So a really important open question is, when we look at all of these legislatures and all these governors who are skeptical of the Common Core, whether they are going to, how they are going to approach those necessary investments and those necessary changes. If you leave the Common Core on the books, but your test is not really a Common Core test, and you're not investing in Common Core training or Common Core aligned curricula and textbooks, it's not exactly clear what it means to say that you're a Common Core state. Third, this brings us to the fact that there's at least 3 strategies states might use if they're trying to pivot off the Common Core. Now, how many states are happy with the Common Core? It's hard to say for sure. As Mike mentioned, more than 40 states originally adopted the Common Core. The vast majority, all but about 3 of those, still have the Common Core in place. And what you tend to hear about, obviously, are the places where Common Core is taking a lot of heat. You don't hear so much about the places where Common Core is popular. At this point, the 2 Common Core testing consortia, Smarter, Balanced, and PARC, have on the order of roughly about slightly over 24 states that are still signed up to use their Common Core aligned tests. That's probably a pretty good base level estimate of the number of states where Common Core is on pretty solid turf right now, about 24 states. There's probably about 6 or 8 states where Common Core is really going to be in hot water in the coming legislative session. And then there's probably, I would guess, another 8 to a dozen states where we'll see how things shake out. Other folks can give you estimates that are higher or lower. For what it's worth, that's kind of my quick glance at the field. When you talk about the 3 states where Common Core is in hot, or the states where Common Core is in hot water, or the 8 to a dozen states where it might be, what's going to happen? Well, one strategy that folks can try to use is just rename the Common Core. So in Florida, it's no longer the Common Core. It's now the Sunshine State Standards. It's basically the Common Core, but the name is intended to make it more palatable. So this is basically a market branding strategy that we've seen some of. A second approach, which also they use in Florida, is to revise the Common Core a little bit. Maybe dump a few little pieces, add some stuff. In Florida, they added a week of handwriting in elementary school. The funny thing is, the more you start tinkering with the Common Core, the more a challenge you run into in terms of the tests. If you want to use one of the Common Core aligned tests, they're going to test on the stuff that the regular Common Core has in it. So if you start dropping stuff and telling teachers they don't have to teach it, that's fine, but kids will still be tested on it. If you add stuff that's not in the regular Common Core, that's fine, but kids still won't be tested on it. So long as you're trying to use a regular Common Core test, well, your ability to tinker with the Common Core is limited. A third approach, like as Mike mentioned, we've seen in Indiana, we've seen in Oklahoma, is states say we're going to get rid of the Common Core, but then states have to go through the business of either putting in place their old curricular standards that they had in place for reading and math 5 years ago, or they have to go through the process of creating new standards in order to put in place. And certainly the process of writing new standards is complicated and challenging and poses lots of concerns and raises questions about what you're going to come out with. And then once you've changed your standards, you have to go through the stuff I mentioned a moment ago, design curriculum, buy textbooks, think about your accountability system, train teachers. And if you have created a brand new set of standards, getting textbooks and tests and teacher training for those can be a challenge. All right. Fourth, I've mentioned several times the importance of the tests themselves. The tests were, there's two major testing, what we call testing consortia. These are two outfits that split about $360 million from the U.S. Secretary of Education. The money came out of the 2009 stimulus. And these two consortia, groups of states, were funded to get together and try to create newer, better tests that would reflect the Common Core. The tests were administered for the first time last spring. Technically, they seem to go okay. There's, you know, if you've read the papers on this stuff, you know, there's some technical glitches, but there were a lot fewer than folks were worried about. Are the test questions good? Are these better tests? Nobody can say for sure. Some of the questions, a few have been released, most have not. They're revising the questions they're asking as they gear up for the spring. Mike Brickman and his colleagues at Fordham are putting together a project to see whether these, which of these testing consortia does a better job reflecting the Common Core, which will be useful. But nobody can say with authority whether questions are clearly better or worse. These are always questions of human judgment, and we're going to have to wind up seeing what the questions are asked and what people think of them. The other challenge is that the Common Core assessments are supposed to be administered on computers, for instance. The idea is they will be newly sophisticated, but no state has enough of the technology in place to let tests be administered entirely on the computers. This is going to create some headaches as far as who gets tested when, and make sure all the kids get tested in the window of available time. So some kids are going to get 2, 3, up to 12 weeks more instruction than other kids, which may create some distortions when it comes to accountability. It's also the case that some kids are going to be tested using paper and pencil. Other students will be tested using the computers and the computer-assisted test. And neither of the two consortia has yet been able to say definitively how comfortable we should be comparing the paper and pencil and the technological results. So a lot of these issues about how good and how reliable and how comfortable we should be with the results of the tests, especially when we use them to rate schools or to evaluate teachers, are going to be things we talk a lot about this spring. We'll be talking about in 2016, and we're going to have to see how bumpy or how smooth all that goes. Fifth, look, it's not just a question of Common Core in the bubble. As many of you are probably aware right now, there's heated conversation on Capitol Hill about reauthorizing No Child Left Behind, which was passed back in 2001 and called for regular testing in grades 3 through 8, again in high school. Well, part of the push on right and left is the notion that maybe that's too much required federal testing. One proposal is to have the federal government only require states to test once in elementary, once in middle school, once in high school. There's others who are unlikely to prevail, but who want to get rid of federal testing requirement altogether. Clearly, depending on how No Child Left Behind were to be written, if it gets reauthorized, might change how often states would be administering these tests, which could have very real impacts on how they're using Common Core and how they're thinking about their standards and their tests. Look, finally, let me just give you a quick prediction, and then we can open this up for conversation or for questions. My prediction is if we're looking 3-4 years out, I would expect that 35 or more states will still have Common Core on their books. It is just really hard and really unrewarding to go through the business of throwing out your old standards and putting in place new ones. However, like I said, I find the most useful way to think about the Common Core, or any standards, not just Common Core, but any standards, is the way you think about that mission statement on the wall of a fast food restaurant. I don't really care what the mission statement says. I care what that company is focusing upon when it evaluates its franchises, when it scores their performance, when it looks at their revenues. And that's really going to be the question of testing. What's getting tested? Are states using the two Common Core consortium? Right now, those two consortium are down to about 35% of tested students across the entire country. I expect that number is going to fall. A number of states are using the ACT tests, but a whole lot of other states are out there talking to test developers about building new tests that they can use. We're not yet clear on how good, if at all good, these tests will be. They may be better than the other Common Core tests. They may be worse. We know for a fact, however, that a lot of this test fragmentation means that these results will not be comparable. So we're back to that railroad gauge problem. We're going to be back to a place where a lot of states make it difficult to compare how kids are doing in Berkeley, California to Boston, Massachusetts, or how difficult to compare how kids are doing, in Dallas to Detroit, because a lot of states are going to have clusters of tests they're sharing rather than all be using uniform tests. This kind of fragmentation, because I also expect many states will rename their Common Cores, that they will tinker with their Common Cores, and they will have tests that reflect their Common Core version. This is going to create a lot of those same railroad gauge challenges for people who train teachers, for people who prepare instructional materials, for people who write textbooks, that they're going to be back to a very similar place where they were 5 or 8 years ago, where they had to customize a lot of this stuff for, and maybe then it was 50 states, maybe in 3 or 4 years it'll be 20+ states and clusters of states. And if that's the case, we're back to a lot of the same dynamics that we've been frustrated with. So frankly, I mean, I think what we are going to wind up seeing in a lot of cases is we are going to have been through a lot of important conversations, wrestled with a lot of issues. If folks are confident the Common Core standards really are better and higher standards than what states had, I think that will be a useful development. I'm not as certain on that count. I don't think the standards will be all that common. I don't think we're going to have all that many comparable tests. And I think in many ways we're going to be having many of the same frustrations that helped spur the push for Common Core 7 years ago. Hey, thank you all so much for indulging me. I know Mike and I would both be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Rick. And yeah, now we are going to take a few questions. I'm going to throw out the first one if you don't mind. In the meantime, if you're on the chat window online, if you want to just put your questions in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll go to the people on the phones as well in just a second. But Rick, I'm wondering, what would a Governor Rick Hess have to say about all this? I mean, you threw out some of the different options that states have. Let's say you find yourself in one of these states that's seeing some backlash on, maybe testing from the left and on those standards from the right. What do you do to, get past this and get back to what I get the sense from some of the things you had to say today, and as I have said in the past, get back to some of those issues that maybe are bigger ticket type items?
Sure. Look, I mean, my attitude is I think, standards work if they're actually driving what you're focused on, which means if they're driving, what you're assessing and your accountability system. And then if you're buying textbooks and training teachers and ways to succeed with that. So I'm of the mind that if you're going to do Common Core, do Common Core. If you think it's good for kids, I think it's good. You got to think it's good for kids. A, because you think the standards are high and rigorous, and reasonable people could certainly think that, and because you think there's going to be much more commonality, especially if you're using the ACT test, the PARCC test, or the SBAC test. In those cases, you'll be able to compare your results to at least 8 or 9 other states. If it's smarter balanced, maybe more. If you're going to do that, do that. Don't rename them, because I think renaming them makes it far too easy for folks to tinker with them later on. Don't tinker with them now because you're adding stuff that won't be on the test, and that doesn't do any good for teachers or kids. Don't delete stuff because then you're not teaching stuff that will be on the test, and that's not fair to kids or teachers. And look, and if you think the Common Core is problematic, just make sure you're clear why the Common Core is problematic. If you don't think they're high and rigorous, hold open hearings on that. Let smart people sit down with your team, hash out where you think that they're coming up short, and think about whether you want what's a better and more improved set of standards for you to use. If you think being able to compare across state lines is important, but you're not crazy about the Common Core, get together with some other states and go ahead and recreate the same dynamic that the Common Core set out to create when it was just supposed to be a group of states and not a national phenomenon. Get 6 or 8 states and go ahead and design standards that you guys like and build a common test that you guys are excited about. But look, I think the worst thing you can do when it comes to standards, because I don't think it's fair to kids or teachers, is to try to, be half fish and half fowl. I just don't know how you adopt standards where you're tinkering with names and tweaking around the edges and sending mixed signals about what's getting taught and why and what's expected. That just seems to me the worst of all worlds.
Just following up on that, Rick, if I could, how do states go about doing that? A lot of the Common Core states, especially on the assessment side of things, have the advantage of some available funds out there. Any idea if you're a state or a group of states just looking to do this, how do you go about developing a new set of tests or standards or both? And then how do you go about then making sure that all of the teachers and all of the school district administrators that have been going through this process for the last few years, probably with some funding, to transition to Common Core, how do you then help them transition to whatever comes next?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's why it's worth kind of really wrestling with the cost and the benefits of the Common Core, kind of publicly, because I think these are exactly the same questions that I think of a lot of states that ask these exact questions you're asking, Mike. Back in 2009, 2010, some states that got on the Common Core bandwagon would not have. And the states that got on board, you would have seen broader support, and those states would be doing it, and other states could be watching. So now I think we see that same dynamic in reverse. And I think, look, I think in a lot of states and a lot of districts, the amount of energy and planning and familiarity of the Common Core has been oversold. And I think in those places in particular, the costs of changing horses aren't as high. I think in places that have really, dived head first into teacher preparation, into changing what they're doing, places like Tennessee or Massachusetts, I think changing gears is probably going to be, just much more of a shock to the system. So I think one question which you raise is, it's worth that governor asking or those legislators asking, okay, how far down this road are we really? It doesn't mean you have to keep following the road or not, but it's good to know, how far down that road are you if you're going to consider doubling back. I think a second thing is, look, the dollars that are procuring materials, that are doing teacher training, are pretty much constant dollars. If you think funding Common Core materials and teacher training isn't good for kids, then it's probably good to shift those dollars over anyway. Staying down a road that you don't think is good for kids probably doesn't help. And the reality is that there just weren't that many new dollars up front to support the procurement of Common Core materials or Common Core teacher training. So the reality is that this is one reason why states may be less far along than they thought they were or hoped that they were, is that they're just doing it out of current operational expenditures for things like materials and training. So that's, again, depending how far down that road you are, there's a sense of let's cut our losses and move those dollars into things that we think are going to be better in terms of curriculum and standards if one is not confident the Common Core is good for students. So I think, look, I think your question puts right on the nub of it. that nobody should treat these as flip decisions, that you are, that the decision to stay with the Common Core is a huge impact in a state on hundreds of thousands or millions of children. So it really matters that the Common Core is focused on the right things, is building the right skills, and if the tests are good and measure what we care about, and it affects the ability of tens of thousands of teachers to do their job well. On the flip side, the decision to change from the Common Core it raises the exact same questions, and just none of this stuff should be entered into lightly or as talking points. These are things where folks just need to dig in, make sure they understand the facts on the ground in their state, and then exercise their best judgment.
Thanks, Rick. So we're going to go to questions from people who are online, but first just want to check, is there anybody on the phones who wants to throw out a question real quick? Why don't we just start with the question from the people who are online. So Rick, how does Common Core or any of the changes that might be made to it affect data collection and student privacy issues like that?
Fantastic question. I think probably you ask different people to give you different answers. My answer is it doesn't. It just doesn't. States have standards in place. Every state has had to have standards since No Child Left Behind. Most states had them ahead of time before No Child Left Behind. Every state had them since. Every state has tested regularly since No Child Left Behind. What Common Core is doing is it's leading states to swap in a different set of standards and a different set of tests. It doesn't in and of itself change anything around FERPA or data privacy. Now, that said, a couple quick thoughts. One, as you use a standardized test across state lines, obviously there's an incentive to be able to compare data, and researchers or others may very well say, hey, we want to start pooling that data not just in a state warehouse, but create a national warehouse. That does not yet exist. It's not clear what it would take to enable it, but that is certainly, as we look forward, something that smart and reasonable people should ask questions about, and should, and they can either regard that as an opportunity to get better at serving kids, or as a huge kind of concern in an era when we've seen what the IRS, and others have done with personal data. Second, it is absolutely true that a lot of the folks who are excited about the Common Core have championed it as a chance to collect lots more data on kids. This is certainly true of the Obama administration. It is true of the Gates Foundation initiative in Bloom. It's absolutely in the minds of some Common Core advocates. I don't think of our friends like Mike and his colleagues at Fordham, but certainly some of those on the left in particular, that they see Common Core as part of an integrated strategy where they're going to get these data points, get them across state lines nationally, collect lots of other data, and be able to build giant data systems of the kind that are envisioned in the Affordable Care Act. Again, none of that actually follows from adopting the Common Core or from the tests, but it's certainly fair to say that this is stuff that some of the Common Core advocates have talked about as a long-term vision for where they would like to head.
Yeah, I think if President Obama thought some of his proposals last night went over like a lead balloon, just imagine if they came out with a national data warehouse. I'm not sure that would work too well. But I think with that, I'm going to kick it back to Lindsay to kind of wrap things up for us. But Rick, certainly appreciate you doing this with us, and I really enjoyed it. And certainly a big thank you to everybody who's joining this and the two previous ALEC sessions on Common Core. I hope to do some more education policy stuff with you guys in the future.
From both of you, Michael and Rick, thanks. It's always a pleasure hearing from both of you. Your knowledge and perspective is always invaluable and vital in education policy all over the United States. Also, thank you to all the participants for joining the last installment of the Past, Present, and Future of the Common Core. As noted on your screen, the past, present, and future of the Common Core webinars will be available for download. Those links will be emailed when they become available. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or if I can provide you with any further information on Common Core. My contact information is on your screen for convenience, and for those of you on the phone, it's LRUSSELL@alec.org. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.